In the scorching heat of a Texas summer in 1945, a group of emaciated women stood frozen at the entrance of a dusty ranch house, their eyes wide with disbelief and terror. Before them stretched a table laden with food, more food than they had seen in months, perhaps years. Plates piled high with bread, bowls overflowing with stew, pitchers of milk sweating in the afternoon sun. The cowboys, who had set this table, watched in confusion as the women recoiled, shaking their heads, backing away from what should have been a miracle. These were not ordinary women. They were Japanese civilian internees who had survived 7 days without food, 7 days of transport across an unforgiving landscape, 7 days of wondering if each moment would be their last. Their bodies were skeletal, their skin stretched tight over protruding bones, their eyes hollow with the kind of hunger that gnaws not just at the stomach, but at the soul itself. And yet they refused to eat. They refused to believe. This is their story, a tale that begins not in Texas, but across an ocean, in a world torn apart by war, hatred, and the kind of suffering that changes people forever. This is the story of how war strips away humanity, how hunger becomes a weapon, how hope dies and is sometimes reborn, and how even the simplest act of kindness can seem impossible to trust when you have been taught that survival means expecting nothing but cruelty. To understand the moment when these women stood trembling before a table of plenty, we must first travel back to a time before war, before internment camps, before the world knew the horrors that human beings could inflict upon one another in the name of national security and wartime necessity. These women came from different walks of life, scattered across the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asian territories that Japan had occupied during its expansion in the years leading up to World War II. Some were wives of Japanese businessmen who had established trading posts in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and other regions where Japanese influence had grown steadily throughout the 1930s. Others were nurses who had volunteered to serve in military hospitals, believing they were contributing to their nation's glory and helping wounded soldiers. Still others were teachers who had been sent to establish Japanese language schools in occupied territories, part of the empire's effort to spread Japanese culture and education. Many were simply civilians who happened to be living in the wrong place at the wrong time when the tide of war turned against Japan. They had grown up in a Japan that taught them about duty, about sacrifice, about the importance of enduring hardship without complaint. They had been raised with the values of their culture, which emphasized group harmony over individual needs, which taught that showing emotion or weakness was shameful, which insisted that women should be strong, resilient, and capable of bearing whatever burdens life placed upon them. These values, instilled from childhood, would both sustain them and torment them during the years to come. When the ship finally docked in California, the women who stumbled down the gangway were barely recognizable as human beings. Sunken eyes stared out of skull-like faces, bones protruded sharply through skin that had lost all elasticity, limbs trembled with weakness. American military personnel who had been assigned to receive them were visibly shocked by their condition, unprepared for the level of deterioration that weeks of near starvation had produced. Medical staff were called immediately, but the facilities at the dock were minimal, designed for processing rather than treatment. The women were loaded onto trains for transport to an internment facility in Texas, a location chosen because of available space and distance from the coasts. They were given some food at last, but their shrunken stomachs could barely handle it, and several became violently ill from eating too quickly after such prolonged deprivation. The train journey took 3 days. 3 days during which they crossed a landscape so vast and varied that it seemed impossible, a country of mountains and deserts and plains that stretched beyond imagining. But the food situation on the train was little better than on the ship. Supplies had been arranged for the journey, but through bureaucratic confusion or simple miscalculation, the rations provided were insufficient. By the time they reached Texas, the women had gone 7 days without adequate food, 7 days during which they had consumed only scraps, only enough to keep them technically alive, but nowhere near enough to restore strength or hope. The Texas facility where they were taken was not a typical internment camp with barbed wire and guard towers. Due to overcrowding in the official camps, authorities had made arrangements with several large ranches in remote areas to house smaller groups of internees temporarily. The women were taken to one such ranch, a sprawling property owned by a family that had reluctantly agreed to accommodate them in exchange for government compensation. The cowboys who worked on this ranch were rough men, shaped by hard labor and the unforgiving Texas climate, but they were not cruel. When they saw the condition of the women stumbling off the transport trucks, something in them stirred, some basic human decency that transcended language barriers and wartime propaganda. These cowboys had never seen people in such desperate condition, had never witnessed the effects of prolonged starvation on the human body and spirit. One of the older ranch hands, a man who had served in World War I and knew something of suffering, immediately went to the ranch house and began organizing food. Within an hour, the cowboys had set up tables under a large oak tree near the bunkhouse where the women would be staying. They brought out everything they could find: bread and butter, stew that had been simmering for the ranch hand's dinner, canned vegetables, dried fruit, even some precious sugar and coffee. They set the table as if preparing for a celebration, arranging the food with care, filling cups and bowls, creating a spread that would have fed twice their number. When the women were led to the tables and saw what had been prepared, something broke inside them. Instead of rushing forward with gratitude, they stopped, they backed away. They shook their heads with a vehemence that confused and hurt the cowboys who had worked so hard to help them. To the Americans, this made no sense. Here were starving people being offered food freely given, and they refused. The cowboys tried to encourage them, gesturing to the food, miming eating, smiling and nodding to show that it was safe, that it was meant for them. But the women would not approach. Some began to cry silently, tears running down hollow cheeks. Others simply stared at the food with expressions of longing mixed with terror. A few started to pray, hands clasped, lips moving soundlessly. The scene became increasingly distressing as the cowboys grew more insistent and the women more resistant, until finally everyone stood frozen in a tableau of incomprehension and fear. But the cowboys could not understand. What they had no way of knowing was that these women had been conditioned by months of cruelty and broken promises. They had learned that food offered freely was usually a trick, a test, a way to identify the weak who would be punished for accepting. They had seen women beaten for taking food without permission, had watched as meals were set out only to be snatched away at the last moment as guards laughed at their desperation. They had been taught through brutal experience that trusting apparent kindness led only to greater suffering. But the refusal went even deeper than fear of tricks or punishment. These women carried within them a cultural understanding of obligation and debt that the cowboys could never comprehend. In Japanese culture, accepting such a gift created an obligation that must be repaid, and they had no way to repay. They were prisoners, powerless, possessing nothing. To accept this food would be to enter into a debt they could never discharge, and the shame of that unpayable obligation felt worse than continued hunger. Moreover, they had been raised to believe that accepting charity was disgraceful, that it showed weakness and brought dishonor not just to themselves, but to their families and their nation. Even in their desperate condition, even after all they had endured, these teachings remained embedded in their consciousness, shaping their responses in ways that seemed irrational to outside observers. There was also the language barrier, absolute and impenetrable. The women spoke only Japanese, the cowboys only English and perhaps some Spanish. Without words, misunderstanding multiplied. The cowboys' friendly gestures were misinterpreted as threatening. Their insistence seemed like coercion. Their confusion looked like anger. And the women's refusal, their tears, their prayers, all of these made no sense to men who had simply tried to do a decent thing. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for one of the younger cowboys, a man barely 20 years old who had been watching the scene with growing distress. He was the youngest son of the ranch owner, raised on stories of hospitality and Christian charity, and he could not bear to watch people suffer when help was so readily available. He walked slowly to the table, picked up a bowl of stew, and sat down on the ground a few feet from the nearest woman. Without looking at her, without making any gesture toward her, he began to eat. He ate slowly, deliberately, making sounds of enjoyment, acting as if he were simply having his own meal and paying no attention to anyone else. Other cowboys, catching on to his strategy, did the same. They sat down with plates and bowls, creating a casual atmosphere, removing the pressure of the offered charity by transforming the meal into something communal rather than something given from strong to weak. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to ease. The women stopped backing away. They watched the cowboys eat, watched carefully for any signs of distress or sickness that might indicate the food was poisoned or spoiled. When no one collapsed, when the eating continued normally and peacefully, the oldest woman among the internees took a tentative step forward. She did not reach for food, but stood at the edge of the circle, observing. One of the cowboys noticed her and, carefully, without sudden movements, pushed a plate toward her across the ground and then turned his attention back to his own meal, giving her space and privacy to make her choice. Minutes passed, long minutes during which no one moved, no one spoke, all breath held, waiting to see what would happen. Then the old woman bent down, picked up a piece of bread from the plate, and brought it to her mouth. She bit into it slowly, chewed carefully, her eyes closing as the taste registered after so many days of emptiness. She did not eat quickly or greedily, but with a deliberateness that spoke of years of discipline and self-control. When she swallowed that first bite, without incident, without any punishment descending upon her, something shifted in the group. One by one, the other women came forward. They moved hesitantly, ready to flee at any moment, but they came. They picked up food carefully, as if it might disappear if handled too roughly. They ate slowly, tears running down many faces, bodies shaking with emotion and weakness. The cowboys continued eating their own meals, deliberately not watching too closely, understanding instinctively that these women needed space and dignity more than they needed attention. Some of the cowboys had their own tears running silently down weathered cheeks as they witnessed suffering they had never imagined and relief they had helped to bring. The meal continued for a long time, much longer than an ordinary dinner, because the women could only eat small amounts before their stomachs, shrunken and damaged by deprivation, rebelled. They would eat a little, rest, then eat a little more, their bodies slowly remembering what it meant to be fed. In the days and weeks that followed that first meal, the relationship between the cowboys and the women slowly evolved from mutual incomprehension to something approaching understanding. The language barrier remained, but humans have ways of communicating that transcend words. The cowboys learned to approach slowly, to offer without insisting, to respect the invisible boundaries that trauma had drawn around each woman. The women learned that not all captors were cruel, that some people could show kindness without expecting anything in return, that perhaps the world contained more complexity than their recent experiences had led them to believe. The ranch became a temporary haven, a place where healing could begin even though the war still raged across the Pacific and the future remained uncertain. Regular meals were established, careful meals designed to rebuild strength without overwhelming damaged digestive systems. The ranch cook, an older Mexican woman who had worked on the property for decades, took special interest in the women's recovery, preparing foods that were gentle and nutritious, teaching the cowboys to be patient with the slow process of rehabilitation. The women began to regain small amounts of weight, the terrifying boniness of starvation slowly filling out, though they would never fully recover the health they had possessed before internment. Some of them began to help with small tasks around the ranch, not because they were forced to, but because activity helped pass the time and gave them some sense of purpose and control over their lives. As the women grew stronger, some rudimentary communication began to develop. One of the cowboys discovered that his grandmother had a Japanese phrasebook from before the war, when Japan and America had not been enemies, when trade and cultural exchange had been commonplace. He brought it to the ranch and began attempting to learn basic words and phrases. His pronunciation was terrible, his grammar non-existent, but the effort itself meant something to the women. They began to teach him, pointing to objects and speaking the Japanese words, laughing sometimes at his attempts to repeat them. And that laughter was itself healing, a reminder that joy could still exist even in difficult circumstances. One of the younger women had learned some English in school before the war, and though she was rusty and hesitant, she began to serve as a translator of sorts, bridging the communication gap in small ways. Through her, stories began to be shared. The women learned that these cowboys were not soldiers, had not fought in the war, were simply men trying to make a living from hard land. The cowboys learned that the women were not enemy agents or willing participants in Japan's military aggression, but simply civilians caught in circumstances beyond their control. These revelations did not erase the fact of war or solve the complex political and ethical questions surrounding internment and treatment of enemy nationals, but they created small spaces of humanity in an otherwise inhumane situation. One day, a government official arrived at the ranch with mail, letters that had been sent months earlier and had followed a tortuous path through military and civilian bureaucracies before finally reaching their intended recipients. Not all the women received letters, but those who did clutched them like precious treasures, their hands shaking as they opened envelopes and unfolded paper. The contents were mixed blessings. Some letters brought news of family members who had survived, who were waiting for the war to end and reunion to become possible. Others brought devastating news of deaths, of homes destroyed in bombing raids, of relatives missing and presumed dead. The women who received bad news grieved quietly, turning their faces away, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The cowboys, witnessing this grief, understood without translation what had happened. They gave the women space to mourn, respecting their pain, even when they could not fully comprehend its dimensions. For the women whose families had survived, the letters brought both comfort and increased anxiety. They now knew they had something to return to, people waiting for them. But the uncertainty of when they would be repatriated and whether conditions in Japan would allow for survival intensified their worry. Japan was being bombed extensively, food shortages were severe throughout the home islands, and the war's end was still not in sight despite the Allied advances across the Pacific. In August of 1945, news reached the ranch that changed everything. Japan had surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war. The war was over. The women received this news with complicated emotions that the cowboys could not fully understand. There was relief that the killing would stop, that perhaps now they could go home, but there was also shame that their nation had been defeated, horror at the descriptions of the atomic bombs and the unprecedented destruction that they had caused, and fear about what surrender would mean for Japan's future. The concept of unconditional surrender was particularly difficult because it implied a level of humiliation and loss of honor that their cultural upbringing made almost unbearable. Some of the women wept openly, no longer caring about maintaining composure, while others retreated into silence, processing the information in private. The cowboys tried to offer comfort, but did not fully grasp why a war's end would bring tears rather than celebration. To them, peace was unambiguously good, a return to normal life and the end of hardship and loss. They could not understand the complex layers of meaning that defeat carried for the Japanese, the sense that their entire worldview had been shattered, that the values they had been raised to revere had proven insufficient to protect their nation.
When word finally came that ships were being prepared for repatriation, the mood at the ranch became bittersweet. The women were eager to go home, to see if their families had survived, to begin rebuilding their lives. But they had also formed unexpected bonds during their time at the ranch, connections with people they never would have met in ordinary life, relationships that had helped them survive and begin to heal. On the last night before departure, the cowboys organized a farewell meal, another table laden with food. But this time the women approached without fear or hesitation. They sat together, Japanese women and American cowboys, sharing food and attempting conversation, laughing at misunderstandings, using hand gestures to fill in where words failed. The ranch cook had attempted to prepare some dishes based on descriptions the women had given of Japanese food, and while the results were not particularly authentic, the effort touched the women deeply. After the meal, one of the older women stood and bowed deeply to the cowboys, speaking in Japanese words that no one present could translate, but whose meaning was clear in tone and gesture. She was thanking them, acknowledging what they had done, expressing gratitude that transcended language. Other women followed, each offering their own bows and words of thanks. The cowboys stood awkwardly, unused to such formal expressions of appreciation, many of them emotional at this parting from people whose arrival they had initially viewed with suspicion and whose humanity they had come to recognize and respect. The journey back to Japan was long and complicated, involving trains and buses and eventually another ship. But the conditions were vastly better than the trip that had brought them to America. They were no longer prisoners or enemy aliens, but civilians being repatriated according to international agreements. They had adequate food, decent accommodations, and access to medical care for those who still suffered from the effects of malnutrition and trauma. The voyage across the Pacific gave them time to prepare mentally for what they would find upon return. They shared stories and fears, wondering if their homes still stood, if their families had survived not just the war, but the difficult months since surrender. They had heard rumors of widespread starvation in Japan, of cities reduced to ash, of an occupation by foreign troops that was reshaping their nation in fundamental ways. As the ship approached the Japanese coast, the women gathered on deck to catch their first glimpse of home in years. What they saw shocked them even though they had been warned. The coastline was scarred, cities visible from the sea showed vast areas of destruction, and the approach to port revealed the extent of Japan's defeat in ways that no words could have prepared them for. This was not the Japan they had left, the proud empire that had seemed destined for greatness. This was a broken nation, occupied and dependent on its former enemies for basic survival. Stepping onto Japanese soil brought overwhelming emotion for all the women. Some knelt and touched the ground, tears flowing freely, while others stood frozen, unable to process the magnitude of return mixed with the reality of destruction around them. The port was crowded with other repatriates, with soldiers returning from overseas, with civilians displaced by bombing, seeking news of relatives. The chaos was immense, the infrastructure strained beyond capacity, and the reception facilities overwhelmed. The women were processed through various checkpoints, their identities verified, their stories briefly recorded, and then they were essentially released to find their own ways in a country that barely had resources for those who had remained throughout the war. For many, the journey to their home villages or what remained of their cities took days or even weeks, traveling through a landscape transformed by fire and defeat. They walked past burned-out buildings, through towns where every structure had been reduced to ash and rubble, seeing people whose faces showed the same hollow hunger they had experienced, the same trauma of survival when so many had not survived. Those whose families had lived in Hiroshima or Nagasaki faced particular horror, finding not just destroyed cities but contamination and radiation sickness, finding family members who had survived the initial blast but were dying slowly from invisible poisons that no one yet fully understood. The reunions when they occurred were intense beyond description. Women who found surviving family members alive fell into embraces that lasted minutes, crying and laughing simultaneously, touching faces and hands to confirm reality. They shared stories of survival, comparing experiences, marveling that both had endured when so many had not. But these joyful reunions were the minority. More common were the women who returned to find their families dead or missing, their homes destroyed, nothing remaining of the lives they had known before the war. These women faced the task of rebuilding from absolute zero, with no resources, no support system, and a society that was itself struggling to survive. Some were taken in by distant relatives who could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone additional mouths. Others ended up in refugee camps that had been established for the homeless and displaced, camps that themselves were desperately undersupplied and overcrowded. The shame that Japanese culture attached to defeat and to accepting charity made this period even more difficult psychologically. The women had survived imprisonment and starvation, had crossed oceans and continents, had endured more than most people face in entire lifetimes, and now they had to find ways to survive in a Japan that no longer resembled the nation they remembered. As years passed and Japan began its remarkable recovery, the women who had been held at the Texas ranch gradually rebuilt their lives. They married or remarried, found work in the new industries emerging from Reconstruction, had children and raised families, but none of them forgot the experience of those years, particularly that moment when they stood before a table of food and could not believe it was meant for them, could not trust that kindness was possible. For some, the memory was too painful to discuss, and they never spoke of their internment or their time in America, locking those experiences away in silence. For others, the story became something they needed to share, to help their children and grandchildren understand what war does to people, how it destroys not just buildings and infrastructure, but trust and the ability to accept basic human decency. A few of them maintained correspondence with people they had met at the ranch, letters that traveled slowly between Texas and Japan, written in broken English or Japanese, or sometimes just containing photographs with a few words. Simple human connections maintained across vast distances and cultural divides. These letters were treasured possessions, evidence that the experience had been real, that unlikely friendships had formed, that even in darkness, some light had persisted.
In examining this history, difficult questions arise about responsibility and accountability. Who bears responsibility for the starvation these women experienced? Is it the guards who controlled the food in the camps? The military planners who miscalculated provisions for transport ships? The bureaucrats who processed paperwork slowly while people went hungry? The politicians who created internment policies in the first place? Or does responsibility diffuse across systems and institutions until it becomes so dispersed that no individual can be held accountable?
These questions matter not just for historical understanding, but for preventing similar failures in the future. The women's experience shows how easily systemic failures can result in individual suffering, how policies made in distant offices can translate to people going 7 days without food, to bodies breaking down, to psychological damage that lasts lifetimes. It demonstrates the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards even during war, even when dealing with enemy nationals, because the alternative is a descent into cruelty that diminishes everyone involved. The cowboys who set that table and could not understand why the women refused represent a different aspect of responsibility: the potential for individuals to choose kindness even when systems have failed, to recognize suffering and respond with compassion rather than indifference. The cultural dimensions of this story deserve deep consideration because they reveal how profoundly our backgrounds shape our perceptions and responses to situations. The women's refusal was rooted in Japanese cultural concepts about obligation, shame, and proper behavior that made accepting charity feel worse than continued hunger. To Western observers, this seems almost incomprehensible, a prioritization of abstract concepts over basic survival needs. But cultural values are not abstract to those who hold them. They are lived realities that shape identity and self-worth, that determine what kinds of actions feel possible and what kinds feel unthinkable. The women could not simply set aside their cultural training because circumstances had changed. Their refusal demonstrates the persistence of cultural identity even under extreme duress, the way that who we are remains embedded in us, regardless of external circumstances. It also reveals the challenges of cross-cultural interaction, particularly in situations of power imbalance. The cowboys meant well, but initially approached the situation from their own cultural framework, assuming that hungry people would naturally accept food if offered. When this assumption proved false, they had to adapt their approach, to find ways of offering that did not create the cultural complications that direct charity imposed. The eventual success of the meal came from the young cowboys' instinctive understanding that reducing the visibility of the giving, making it seem more communal and less like charity, allowed the women to accept without feeling the full weight of obligation that their culture imposed. The psychological impact of prolonged hunger and the betrayal of trust that these women experienced cannot be overstated. Trauma research in subsequent decades has revealed how deeply such experiences embed themselves in the brain and body, creating lasting changes in how people respond to stress, how they perceive threats, and how they interact with others. For these women, the effects likely included hypervigilance, difficulty trusting, even in safe circumstances, perhaps flashbacks for nightmares that persisted for years or even lifetimes. The refusal to eat when food was offered was a trauma response, a protective mechanism triggered by past experiences where trusting apparent kindness had led to punishment or disappointment. Understanding this helps explain what might otherwise seem irrational behavior. Their brains and bodies were protecting them based on learned patterns, even though in this specific instance, the food was genuinely offered with good intentions and no strings attached. The challenge for trauma survivors is that these protective mechanisms, which were adaptive and necessary in dangerous situations, continue to activate even when the danger has passed, making it difficult to accept help or trust others when doing so would actually be beneficial. Recovery from such trauma is a long process that requires safety, support, and often professional help, none of which was readily available to these women when they returned to a devastated Japan struggling with its own collective trauma of defeat and occupation. What lessons can be drawn from this story of Japanese women who starved for 7 days and then could not believe that cowboys genuinely wanted to feed them? Perhaps the first lesson is about the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards even during war, even toward enemies. The conditions these women endured, the hunger they experienced, the psychological damage they sustained, none of this was necessary, even accepting the argument for internment itself. Basic provisions could have been calculated correctly, supply chains maintained, human dignity preserved. That these things did not happen reflects systemic failures that should inform how we design and monitor institutions responsible for holding people against their will. The second lesson concerns the lasting damage that deprivation and cruelty cause. The women's inability to trust the cowboys' kindness shows how thoroughly negative experiences can reshape human psychology. We cannot simply expect people who have been traumatized to respond rationally when offered help. Healing requires patience, consistency, and an understanding that trust must be rebuilt slowly through repeated demonstrations of safety and goodwill. The third lesson is about the potential for human connection even across seemingly unbridgeable divides. The cowboys and the women had every reason to remain strangers or even enemies. They shared no common language, came from radically different cultures, and were on opposite sides of a devastating war. Yet, through patience and basic human decency, they found ways to connect, to help, and eventually to care about each other's welfare. The act of setting a table with food seems so simple, so basic, that it hardly deserves attention. Yet, in this context, it became profound. The cowboys were not required to do this. They were not ordered to prepare a feast or go beyond minimal requirements. They chose to do it because they saw suffering and wanted to alleviate it, because their own values and upbringing taught them that hospitality and care for others mattered, because they could not stand by and do nothing when action was possible. This choice matters because it demonstrates that individuals have agency even within larger systems. The internment system was unjust, the war was horrific, the suffering widespread. But within that context, individual humans could still make choices that reduced suffering rather than adding to it. The cowboys' kindness did not erase what the women had endured, did not solve the larger problems of war and internment, did not instantly heal trauma or restore trust. But it mattered. It provided food when there was hunger, offered gentleness when there had been cruelty, demonstrated that not all people were threats. For some of the women, that table, set under a Texas oak tree, became a turning point, a moment when they began to believe that survival might be possible, that perhaps the world was not entirely without mercy. For the women who survived this ordeal, the concept of home became complicated in ways that those with stable lives struggled to understand. Home was where they had been born and raised, where their families lived, where their cultural roots ran deep. But home was also a place they had left or been removed from, a place that had changed beyond recognition by the time they returned, a place where many of them struggled to reestablish lives after years of absence and trauma. For some, the Texas ranch became another kind of home in memory, a place where they had found unexpected safety and kindness, where healing had begun. This did not mean they wanted to stay in America or felt America was home in the way Japan was. Rather, it reflected the complex reality that meaningful experiences and connections can occur in unexpected places, that home can be both a physical location and an emotional state, that sometimes the places where we experience turning points become important to our sense of self even when we never planned to be there and would not choose to return. The women's relationship to home, to belonging, to identity was shaped by their displacement and suffering in ways that made simple categories inadequate. One of the most profound questions these women had to wrestle with in the aftermath of war and internment was the question of forgiveness. Who did they need to forgive, and was forgiveness even possible or desirable? Some felt that forgiving the guards who had treated them cruelly, the officials whose negligence had led to starvation, the systems that had imprisoned them despite their non-combatant status would be betraying the suffering they had endured, would minimize the wrong that had been done. Others found that carrying anger and bitterness was exhausting, that it continued to give power to those who had hurt them, that moving forward required some form of letting go, even if that did not mean forgetting or excusing what had happened. The cowboys presented a different question of forgiveness because they had done nothing that required forgiving. If anything, the women felt indebted to them for kindness shown when they were powerless and desperate. Yet even here complexity existed, because the cowboys were Americans, representatives of the nation that had imprisoned them, part of the system even if they had acted counter to its cruelties. Some women were able to separate individual actions from national policies, to appreciate the cowboys' kindness while still resenting the larger circumstances. Others struggled with more conflicted feelings, grateful and resentful simultaneously, aware of contradictions but unable to fully resolve them. These questions of forgiveness and moving forward had no simple answers, and different women reached different conclusions based on their own experiences, personalities, and circumstances. For historians trying to document and understand this period, stories like those of the Japanese women at the Texas ranch present significant challenges. Official records often provide only bare facts about numbers of people moved from location to location, rations provided according to regulations, dates, and logistics. They rarely capture the human experience of hunger, fear, and eventual tentative trust. Recovering these human stories requires finding and interviewing survivors willing to share painful memories, translating across language barriers, contextualizing individual experiences within larger historical patterns, and doing all this before the generation that lived through these events passes away. Many stories have already been lost because survivors chose not to speak about their experiences or passed away before historians recognized the importance of documenting these particular aspects of the war. The story of the refused meal survived because it was so dramatic and unusual that both the women and the cowboys remembered it clearly and shared it within their communities, eventually bringing it to the attention of researchers. How many other stories of suffering and small kindnesses have disappeared because they seemed too ordinary to preserve or because the trauma was too great to put into words? The historical record is necessarily incomplete, built from fragments that survive through accident and determination, and we must always remember that what we know represents only a small portion of what happened. Telling the story of these Japanese women raises questions about representation and voice. Who has the right to tell this story, and whose perspective should be centered? The women themselves are the obvious choice, but many are no longer alive to speak for themselves, and even when they were, language barriers and cultural reticence sometimes made it difficult for them to share their experiences fully with Western researchers. The cowboys' perspective is also valid and important, but focusing too much on their kindness risks turning the story into a redemption narrative for Americans rather than a story about Japanese women's suffering and survival. The challenge is to honor all perspectives while keeping the focus on those who experienced the greatest harm and whose voices have been historically marginalized. This requires careful attention to whose viewpoint is being privileged in any telling, what assumptions are being made, and whether the narrative serves to illuminate the women's experiences or inadvertently centers the feelings and actions of those with more power. These questions matter because storytelling shapes how we understand history and whose experiences we consider important and worthy of remembering. Today, more than 80 years after the events in question, the legacy of this story continues to resonate. The Texas ranch where the women stayed has changed hands, been modernized, perhaps no longer even exists in recognizable form. The oak tree under which tables were set may have died or been cut down. The physical traces of that moment have largely disappeared into time, but the meaning persists,
carried forward by descendants of both the women and the cowboys, by historians who document the period, by anyone who hears the story and recognizes in it something important about human nature and the choices we make in difficult circumstances. The story appears in museums dedicated to World War II history and Japanese-American experiences, in educational curricula about the war, in documentary films and books exploring the complexities of internment and occupation. Each retelling brings new interpretations and emphases, highlighting different aspects depending on the concerns of the particular moment. Contemporary retellings often emphasize themes of trauma and its persistence, of cross-cultural understanding, of the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards. These emphases reflect current concerns, but also reveal genuine aspects of the original events that remain relevant regardless of when the story is told.